The question of whether the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport should be legalized goes to the heart of what we think sport is for: human excellence or pharmacological arms race, fair play or spectacle at any cost. In this script, we will explore what PEDs are, why athletes use them, the major scandals that have shaped public opinion, and the strongest arguments both for and against legalizing them before returning to the central ethical dilemma. Imagine a 100-meter Olympic final. 8 athletes crouch in the blocks. All have trained for years, but half of them are using carefully monitored, scientifically optimized performance-enhancing drug regimens. The other half are natural, relying only on training, diet, and rest. Would that race still mean the same thing to us? Right now, performance-enhancing drugs are banned by almost all major sports under the World Anti-Doping Agency WADA code, which maintains an annual prohibited list of substances and methods that athletes are not allowed to use in competition. Yet in practice, doping remains widespread, enforcement is imperfect, and a growing chorus of commentators and scholars are asking a provocative question: if banning performance-enhancing drugs is not working, should we consider legalizing and regulating them instead? Performance-enhancing drugs include a wide and evolving set of substances and methods that can improve strength, speed, endurance, recovery, focus, or body composition beyond what an athlete could reasonably achieve through training, nutrition, and rest alone. They range from synthetic hormones and anabolic steroids to blood-boosting drugs, stimulants, and newer agents like selective androgen receptor modulators, SARMs. Common categories include anabolic androgenic steroids, AAS. They are a synthetic version of testosterone that build muscle and increase strength. Erythropoiesis-stimulating agents like erythropoietin, EPO, which increase red blood cell production and boost aerobic capacity. Human growth hormone, HGH, and related peptides, which influence growth, recovery, and body composition. Stimulants, including amphetamines and other agents that increase alertness, reduce fatigue, and enhance aggressiveness. Blood doping methods, from transfusions of stored blood to sophisticated microdosing with EPO. And finally, newer agents such as SARMs, designed to selectively activate androgen receptors with fewer side effects than classical steroids. Importantly, not all ergogenic aids are banned. Legal substances such as creatine, caffeine, and many nutritional supplements are widely used and can have noticeable performance effects, illustrating how blurry the line can be between acceptable and unacceptable enhancement. So why do athletes dope? For many athletes, the temptation to use performance-enhancing drugs comes from the enormous gap between the rewards of success and the consequences of failing. Medals, professional contracts, sponsorship deals, national prestige, and personal identity can all depend on fractions of a second or a few extra kilograms lifted. In that context, even a small pharmacological edge can feel impossible to refuse. Historically, doping has occurred in many sports and at all levels, from adolescents trying creatine and pro-hormones in gyms to elite Olympians on state-organized steroid programs. The logic is often the same. If my rivals are doing it, can I afford to stay clean? In endurance sports, erythropoietin and blood transfusions offer significant improvements by increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, which can make the difference between staying with the pack and being dropped on a mountain climb. In power and speed sports, anabolic steroids can accelerate muscle growth and recovery, allowing athletes to train harder and more often than would otherwise be possible. This arms race mentality is amplified by money, media attention, and national expectations, creating a culture in which preparation becomes an equal for doping, as former professional cyclist David Miller memorably described. but how we got here, as public attitudes toward performance-enhancing drugs have been shaped by high-profile scandals that seem to undermine the credibility of entire sports. These cases are crucial for understanding why performance-enhancing drug use is currently banned, and why some now question whether prohibition has failed. At the 1988 Seoul Olympics, Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson won the 100-meter final in a staggering world record time of 9:79 seconds, beating heavy favorite Carl Lewis. Days later, he tested positive for the anabolic steroid stanozolol. Johnson was stripped of his gold medal and record, and the scandal became a defining moment in modern anti-doping history, convincing many that sprinting was deeply contaminated by steroids. In the years that followed, accusations and subsequent admissions suggested that performance-enhancing drugs use was widespread among top sprinters, raising a painful question: were we watching human performance or a chemistry competition? In another case, the American sprinter Marion Jones was one of the biggest stars of the 2000 Sydney Olympics, winning 5 medals, including 3 golds. Years later, investigations into the Balco laboratory revealed that she had used several banned substances, including the designer steroid tetrahydrogestrinone. Jones, eventually admitted to doping, was stripped of her medals and even served prison time for lying to federal investigators. Balco's client list extended beyond Jones, implicating multiple track athletes and Major League Baseball players, and demonstrating that sophisticated doping programs can stay ahead of testing for years. Perhaps the most famous modern doping case is that of Lance Armstrong, 7-time Tour de France winner and global cancer survivor icon. For years, Armstrong denied allegations of doping. Eventually, a detailed report by the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency described what it called the most sophisticated, professionalized, and successful doping program that sport has ever seen, involving erythropoietin, blood transfusions, and other drugs used systematically across his teams. Armstrong was banned for life and stripped of all his Tour de France titles, and later publicly confessed. The Armstrong case revealed not just individual cheating, but a culture in which doping was normalized in elite cycling, making it extremely difficult for clean athletes to compete. It also exposed how easily testing could be evaded through microdosing, timing, and complicity within teams. More recently, investigations into Russian sport uncovered a state-supported doping program that involved hundreds of athletes across multiple sports, systematic tampering with samples, and institutional cover-ups. WADA reports described a deep-seated culture of drug use, leading to bans, stripped medals, and the exclusion or neutral status of Russian teams at major international events. These scandals, from Johnson to Jones, Armstrong to Russia, demonstrate that despite strict bans, testing, and punishment, doping has repeatedly infiltrated elite sport on a massive scale. This history fuels the argument that prohibition isn't eliminating performance-enhancing drugs, it is driving them underground. One of the main reasons behind performance-enhancing drugs are banned is concern for athlete health and safety. Anabolic steroids, erythropoietin, and other agents can cause serious short- and long-term harm, especially at the high doses often used in sport. Anabolic steroids are synthetic derivatives of testosterone designed to maximize muscle-building effects while retaining androgenic properties. They can dramatically increase muscle mass and strength, but at a cost. In men, chronic use at supraphysiologic doses is associated with testicular shrinkage, reduced sperm production and infertility, gynecomastia, acne, tendon injuries, liver tumors, adverse changes in cholesterol, and increased cardiovascular risk. In addition, in women, potential effects include deepening of the voice, menstrual disturbances, clitoral enlargement, body hair changes, and permanent infertility. and psychiatric effects can include mood swings, aggression, depression, anxiety, and insomnia. Many of these harms arise because athletes often take doses far higher than those used for legitimate medical indications and may stack multiple steroids in complex cycles without medical supervision. Erythropoietin, EPO, is a hormone produced by the kidneys that stimulates red blood cell production. Synthetic EPO and related drugs are invaluable in treating anemia from kidney disease, but when misused by athletes, they can dangerously thicken the blood. Increasing hematocrit through EPO or blood transfusion can improve oxygen delivery and endurance, but also raises the risk of blood clots, heart attacks, strokes, and pulmonary or cerebral emboli. There have been concerns that unexplained deaths of some endurance athletes in the 1990s may have been linked to undetected EPO misuse, especially when combined with dehydration and intense exertion. Stimulants can cause arrhythmias, hypertension, heat stroke, and psychological dependence. Human growth hormone misuse may lead to joint pain, insulin resistance, and abnormal growth of tissues. Because black market performance-enhancing drugs are often manufactured and distributed without quality control, they may be contaminated or mislabeled, adding further risks. From a medical perspective, one of the strongest arguments against legalizing performance-enhancing drugs is that normalization and escalation of use could increase these harms, especially among younger athletes who may feel compelled to use them to stay competitive. Opponents of legalization argue that performance-enhancing drugs bans protect fairness, health, and the meaning of sport. Their reasoning can be grouped into several key themes. One central point is that sport is built on the idea of a level playing field, where athletes compete under the same rules and the outcome reflects their talent, dedication, and tactics, not their pharmacologist's skill. Allowing performance-enhancing drugs, critics say, would shift the focus from training and innate ability to who has the best drug regimen, the most money for medical support, or the least scruples about pushing biological limits. They point out that unequal access to advanced medical monitoring and designer drugs would likely favor wealthy nations and teams, worsening existing inequalities in sport. Instead of reducing cheating, legalization could simply replace undercover doping with an openly unequal pharmacological arms race. Even if performance-enhancing drugs used were technically voluntary, social and economic pressures could make it effectively compulsory for serious competitors. If the best athletes in a sport all adopt legal performance-enhancing drug regimens, clean athletes may have little realistic choice but to follow or abandon their dreams. This is especially troubling in youth and adolescent sport, where young athletes might feel forced to use potentially dangerous drugs at a time when they are biologically and psychologically more vulnerable. From this perspective, legalization does not enhance freedom. It shifts coercive pressure from institutions to peer and market forces. As noted earlier, performance-enhancing drugs carry significant health risks, particularly at high doses and when used without appropriate indications. Even with medical supervision, long-term effects of chronic supraphysiologic exposure to many agents remain uncertain, especially when multiple drugs are combined. Opponents argue that sports organizations have a duty of care to protect athletes from pressures that encourage self-harm, similar to limits on extreme weight cutting or unsafe equipment. Legalizing performance-enhancing drugs might make it easier to monitor their use, but it could also normalize risk-taking behavior and raise the baseline level of drug use across entire sports. Finally, many critics believe that sport has intrinsic values beyond entertainment and records. Watching an athlete achieve a world-class performance is inspiring partly because it represents the outer edge of human training, discipline, and genetic potential, not pharmacological engineering. If performance-enhancing drugs were openly legal and widely used, some worry that records and performances would lose their authenticity for spectators and participants alike. The sense that this is what a human body can do might give way to this is what a medically enhanced body can do, changing the nature of the achievement. On the other side of the debate, advocates of legalization argue that bans are ineffective, inconsistent, and paternalistic, and that a regulated performance-enhancing drugs environment could actually be safer and fairer. One central claim is that doping is already widespread, despite decades of testing and punishment. As the Armstrong and Russian cases showed, sophisticated doping programs can evade detection for years, especially when there is institutional complicity or access to designer drugs that tests are not yet designed to detect. Rather than eliminating performance-enhancing drugs, bans may simply push their use into the shadows, where athletes rely on unregulated black market products and dishonest medical advice. From this perspective, current anti-doping policies create a dangerous cat-and-mouse game in which only some dopers are caught, leading to an uneven and arbitrary enforcement landscape. Legalization advocates suggest that allowing certain performance-enhancing drugs under medical supervision could create a more honest environment. Instead of lying, cheating, and pretending that elite sport is entirely drug-free, athletes and teams could work with doctors to design safe, monitored regimens within agreed limits. This would not necessarily mean anything goes. Regulation could set maximum allowed doses, require medical screening, and ban the most dangerous practices, similar to how some sports regulate permissible equipment or weight categories. The key shift would be from blanket prohibition to harm reduction and transparency. Another argument is based on autonomy. Professional athletes are adults who routinely take significant risks. Concussions in American football, repeated collisions in rugby, high-speed crashes in cycling and motorsport. Allowing them to choose to use certain performance enhancers with informed consent and medical oversight may be more ethically consistent than banning those substances while tolerating other serious risks. Some ethicists argue that banning performance-enhancing drugs treats athletes like children, denying them the right to make decisions about their own bodies and careers, especially when many performance-enhancing drugs are legal to prescribe in non-sport contexts. If using a drug like testosterone is allowed for medical hypergonadism, they ask, why should its supervised use be categorically forbidden for performance enhancement? From a public health perspective, legalizing and regulating performance-enhancing drugs could potentially reduce some of the harms associated with clandestine use. If athletes could access pharmaceutical-grade products, regular blood tests, cardiac monitoring, and evidence-based guidelines, they might avoid the most extreme and dangerous practices seen in underground doping regimes. Columnists and commentators have suggested that allowing regulated performance-enhancing drugs use would remove the incentive to rely on shady back-alley transactions for untested drugs, lowering the risk of contamination, overdose, and uncontrolled polypharmacy. In this view, the realistic choice is not between a clean sport and a doped sport, but between an unregulated black market sport and a regulated, medically supervised one. Finally, some proponents lean into sports' entertainment function. They argue that fans are primarily interested in seeing extraordinary performances, faster sprints, longer home runs, harder hits, superhuman endurance. If performance-enhancing drugs can safely raise the performance ceiling and produce more spectacular events, legalization could even increase fan engagement. Finally, some proponents lean into sports' entertainment function. They argue that fans are primarily interested in seeing extraordinary performances, faster sprints, longer home runs, harder hits, superhuman endurance. If performance-enhancing drugs can safely raise the performance ceiling and produce more spectacular events, legalization could even increase fan engagement. This perspective is controversial because it risks reducing athletes to entertainers whose bodies can be modified for the audience's pleasure. But it highlights a tension. Is sport primarily about human limits or about maximizing spectacle? Between total prohibition and complete legalization, several middle ground proposals have been suggested, each with its own challenges. One idea is to allow certain categories of enhancement, for example, low-dose testosterone, specific recovery-aiding drugs, or mild blood boosting within strict hematocrit limits, while continuing to ban the most dangerous or extreme substances. This could acknowledge that some enhancement is inevitable while trying to limit harms. However, drawing the line between permissible and impermissible enhancement is notoriously difficult. Current anti-doping rules already struggle with borderline substances like high-dose caffeine, powerful yet legal supplements, and therapeutic use exemptions for legitimate medical needs. Expanding the gray area might increase rather than decrease complexity and disputes. Another suggestion is to create separate categories: a natural league with strict anti-doping enforcement and an enhanced league where regulated performance-enhancing drugs use is allowed. In theory, this would preserve a space for traditional sport while offering an outlet for those who wish to push pharmacological limits. In practice, such a split raises questions about funding, public interest, and athlete migration between categories. There is also concern that even with separate divisions, pressures from sponsors and broadcasters could push athletes toward the enhanced category, again undermining genuine choice. Any legalization or partial legalization approach depends heavily on robust medical monitoring and equal access to safe drugs and expertise. Without careful design, legalization might simply advantage better-resourced nations and teams and leave less wealthy athletes using cheaper, riskier products. Ensuring global equity in a regulated performance-enhancing drugs regime would be a major logistical and ethical challenge. So should the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport be legalized? Supporters of legalization argue that prohibition has failed to eliminate doping, has created hypocrisy and dangerous underground markets, and undermines athlete autonomy. They envision a future in which athletes work with doctors under transparent regulations, where some level of enhancement is accepted as part of elite sport, and where record-breaking performances are openly understood as both human and pharmacological achievements. Opponents counter that legalizing performance-enhancing drugs would fundamentally change what sport is about, eroding fair play, coercing athletes into risky regimens, and normalizing serious health risks, especially for young aspiring competitors. They emphasize that the ideal of clean sport, even if imperfectly realized, remains important for protecting athletes and preserving the integrity of competition. Ultimately, this debate forces us to ask not just, does banning performance-enhancing drugs work? But what do we want sport to be? A pure test of natural talent and hard work? A managed spectacle of human pharmacological synergy? Or something in between, where some enhancements are quietly tolerated while others are condemned? As you listen to this documentary, consider which values matter most to you: fairness, safety, autonomy, authenticity, or entertainment. The answer to whether performance-enhancing drugs should be legalized may depend less on chemistry and more on what we, as a global sporting community, decide sport is supposed to represent.